Hello and welcome to the Global Agriculture Innovation Forum. I'm Gerald Shively, Associate Dean and Director of International Programs in the College of Agriculture at Purdue University. I'm very pleased that you have joined us for this, the first session in our final theme of the forum, focusing on scaling and food systems transformation. Those of you who were with us for the Scale Up Conference at Purdue University in 2018, or at the African Green Revolution Forum in Ghana in 2019, will recognize today's theme, as well as some of our discussants. Although a number of previous sessions in this year's forum have highlighted the importance of scaling agricultural innovations, the next three sessions place scaling front and center in the conversation and bring to the virtual stage today's global thought leaders on the subject. To lead today's discussion, which is being held in conjunction with the Scaling Community of Practice, I'm pleased to introduce our moderators. Julie Howard, Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and Frank Place, Director of the IFPRI-led CGIAR program on policies, institutions, and markets. I'll now hand it over to Julie and Frank. But before I do, I'd like to remind everyone that recordings of all forum events, 18 thus far, are available on the forum website. And now, on behalf of the organizing committee, our advisory group, and everyone contributing behind the scenes to this effort, and with special thanks to USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service, our sponsor, I'd like to welcome you to a conversation on scaling and food systems transformation. Please enjoy the program, and please stay for the live question and answer session that will follow the presentations.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Jerry. Welcome, everybody. We in the Scaling Community of Practice are honored and excited to collaborate with Purdue University on today's session on scaling, which, as Jerry said, is the first of three panels on scaling that are going to take place over the coming weeks. I'd first like to say a few words about the Scaling Community of Practice, or COP as we know it. COP was founded 6 years ago by Larry Cooley, our first speaker, and also Johannes Lin. The purpose of the COP is to provide a platform, firstly, for knowledge exchange among experts and practitioners on approaches to scaling up development interventions. It's also a place to develop partnerships, a place also to champion the idea that scaling up development impact is critical for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and climate change targets. The COP is all volunteer and now has more than 700 members from over 200 institutions all over the world. The members represent many sectors and thematic areas of professional expertise. It has 9 working groups: education, health, agriculture, nutrition, social enterprises, youth employment, climate change, fragile states, and monitoring and evaluation. And I have to say that one of the things I enjoy most about the community of practice is the ability to learn from these other sectors. How do they do scaling? What would they do differently? What can we take into agriculture and rural development? Your co-moderators today, myself and Dr. Frank Place, the Agriculture and Rural Development Working Group, along with our colleagues, Leonard Waltering and Maria Boa of CIMMYT and Mark Heisinger of USAID. And we know that many of you listening in are already members of the COP and ARD Working Group. And for the others, we warmly welcome you to join us. Please check out our website at scalingcommunityofpractice.com. Well, as Jerry said, today's session really builds on our previous work at Purdue in convening the 2018 Conference on Innovations in Agriculture, Scaling Up to Reach Millions, and also on the publication that Larry Cooley and I co-authored following the conference, the Scale Up Sourcebook. You can find the links in the resource section on Purdue's website here. The 2018 conference represented an important milestone. The agriculture sector up to that point had been somewhat slower than other sectors to focus on scaling, but the 2018 conference was an inflection point that showed how momentum and experience of scaling in agriculture had clearly accelerated along with the availability of tools for scaling and case studies. Today, we think that 2021 represents another major inflection point. The UN Food Systems Summit was held in September, and the preparatory work leading up to the summit and the summit discussions itself have changed our conceptual framework for agriculture and rural development. There's been a shift away from the productivity-centric focus of the last few decades. And now, while we continue to acknowledge the critical importance of increasing productivity in agriculture, we're also adopting a wider food systems lens. This perspective explicitly recognizes the relationship of the food system to human health and nutrition, to environmental sustainability, to economic development, to resilience and equity. The UN Food Systems Summit also recognized how far we are from meeting the SDGs in just 9 years and the impossibility of meeting them without a major transformation of food systems. The imperative to scale results and the impact was a theme that ran through every single UN Food Systems Summit session. So the guiding question for today's discussion, and really for all three of the scaling panels, is what does this shift to food systems mean for how we think about and how we do scaling related to agriculture and rural development? So now I'd like to turn it over to my co-moderator, Dr. Frank Place, to expand a little on the role of systems change and scaling in his organization, the CGIAR, and to introduce our first speaker today. Frank?
Yeah, thanks very much, Julie. Yes, let me say a few words about scaling the CGIAR and in the context of the CGIAR reforms. Scaling as a concept and imperative within the CGIAR is not new. However, it didn't gain a shared understanding of what it means for our research organization and how it could be mainstreamed until quite recently, following more concerted efforts from a group of scaling champions within the system and with more investment in scaling expertise. These recent advances found a home in the CGIAR reform process towards the One CGIAR. So let me first say a few words about the One CGIAR reforms. The CGIAR is transitioning from 15 semi-autonomous centers, which were dominantly commodity or region-based, to a much more integrated, coordinated approach that will bring whole of CGIAR resources to bear on critical global, regional, and country programs. The vision of One CGIAR remains highly results-oriented, with ambitions to transform food, land, and water systems to contribute to ambitious targets in 5 impact areas: poverty, nutrition, gender, climate, and environment, through affecting changes in behaviors, or as we call them, outcomes. The impetus for change is that while the CGIAR boasts a massive pool of talent and holds other comparative advantages in networks of locations and partnerships, its current organizational structure creates too many silos and fragmented projects to effectively contribute to these ambitions. The current cross-cutting programs, of which mine is one of them, the CGIAR research programs, will give way to new initiatives that will be resourced through pooled funds. The expectation is that pooled funding will grow, the number of smaller bilateral project grants will shrink, and the overall resource envelope will grow. There are reasons to be very optimistic on the development, internal use, and outward application of scaling concepts and tools in the One CGIAR. There is more attention and more engagement on scaling. Scaling is obviously very important to the ambitions of the new research and innovation strategy. But scaling concepts and tools have also been mainstreamed into the thinking behind the 2030 strategy and the new initiative proposals and implementation. For example, the application of the scaling readiness tool into the proposal designs for each of the new initiatives. Each CGIAR initiative has allocated funding to integrate lessons learned on scaling principles, tools, and frameworks, and the science of scaling as well. Becoming One CGIAR makes collaboration easier among the different disciplines and focal areas such as crops, livestock, water, land, climate, which also pushes discussions on scaling into more of a systems direction, which we all want to see. But there are many challenges in the operationalization of this. 3 key ones are: first, to be able to provide sufficient scaling support to research teams that have variable levels of experience with scaling concepts and tools, as you might imagine. Will we have sufficient expertise to do this within CGIAR or through external partnerships? Second is the management and coordination of scaling research and support, because scaling is of interest to many of the new units being created within one CGIAR. And how can we coordinate across that? And then finally, having the space and time for learning on how to improve the use of scaling concepts and tools in the one CGIAR. Fortunately, we have a more cohesive community of scaling experts in the CGIAR, and many of them belong to this ARD community of practice as well. And they have gained reputation, agency, and responsibility to steer the CGIAR on scaling. And so I'm very optimistic that this will continue to move in the right direction. Now, a couple of words on today's program. We will listen to 3 consecutive recorded presentations from Larry Cooley, from Didi Nunelli, and Susan Jamba. That will be followed by an open Q&A session in which Julie and I will be posing questions that come from you, the audience. That will take up the first 90 minutes of our session, and then the final 30 minutes will be allocated for the Agriculture and Rural Development Working Group business session, to which you are all invited. Just stay on the Zoom call if you to join that session. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker. The first speaker is Larry Cooley. He is founder, former president, and now president emeritus and senior advisor at Management Systems International, or MSI. He is also, as Julie mentioned, the co-founder of the Global Community of Practice on Scaling. He has kindly engaged in many of the events and brainstorming sessions of the Agriculture and Rural Development Working Group, and this is yet another example. Each time I am stimulated by Larry's insights, and I look forward to his remarks today. With that, on with the video, please.
Thanks so much for the chance to be here with you today and to talk about a favorite subject of mine, namely scaling. As you will have just heard a few minutes ago, the event in 2018 at Purdue was, at least in my opinion, a real watershed in our understanding of scaling smallholder agriculture and in the approach we took to it. We came with lots of different definitions of scaling, but we all agreed on the following 3 pieces as being central to any decent concept of scaling. 1, the solution has to be at least at a scale commensurate with the need. 2, the impact needs to be meaningful in relationship to that need. And 3, the solution needs to be sustainable in every sense of the word sustainable. So absent coverage that's adequate, impact that's sufficient, and sustainability that's real, we're not, in our opinion, talking about scaling in a fundamental sort of a way. We then went on to talk about, well, what does it really take to scale effectively smallholder agriculture? And coming out of that conference, we tried our best, Julie Howard and myself, to summarize the high points of that in something that became a source book on scaling that some of you may have seen. Those concepts and those points were then socialized in a lot of different fora, but the ones of most interest might be the Agrifora, the World Food Prize, and the Food Security Summit. I'm going to try, for purposes of launching this conversation, to remind people of what I think were the 7 most important lessons or takeaways from that discussion. And then I'm going to tell you about 2 things that I think have changed or evolved since that time. So let me first start with the 7. Number 1, there's no such thing as a purely commercial pathway to scale for agriculture. The government, policy, subsidy, regulatory dimensions absolutely cross-cut everything in agriculture, developed and developing country alike. So give up the fiction that there's something that's a purely commercial pathway. The role of government is important. Number 2, partnerships play a central role. We knew that before, but one of the things we came to understand was that particularly important were partnerships in the middle of the value chain, things like equipment leasing and input provision that hadn't received the attention that they deserved, and that some of those things lent themselves to public-private partnerships, not just private-private partnerships. Number 3, we learned that projects were not our friend in all of this, in all cases, because the project mentality, which tends to take long processes and break them into short chunks, that tends to take systemic and indirect effects and subordinate them to immediate and direct effects, and it tends to understate the role of third parties in political economy in trying to make things happen, often oversimplified and sometimes misdirected the effort. So we try to position what we call the scaling mindset as an alternative to the project mindset. 4, sometimes we think about innovation way too narrowly. We think about the technology, and our mental model is prototype, test, rollout. What we've learned is that the pathway to scale is much more circuitous than that, and often involves lots of change, but also lots of factors beyond those in the direct control of implementers. And so for us now, innovation is still a very valid concept, but it's a broader concept of innovation than simply the technology. Number 5, we elevated and highlighted something that we called intermediation. These are all of the functions that intervene between a good innovation and broad application. It might involve things like raising capital. It might involve convening various stakeholders. It might involve building partnerships. You can add to that list yourselves. But what we came to realize is those intermediation functions tend to be the broken part of the business cycle. We have systems for funding innovation. We have systems for delivering goods and services. We don't have very good systems for trying to take the best innovations and move them across into the mainstream systems. In the private sector, the pure private sector, that's what venture capital does. But in our world, often it's nobody's job. Number 6, we talked a lot about monopoly and monopsony. And we realized that sometimes in order to create the incentives that are needed to try to move an innovation towards scale, we can and even should create temporary monopolies or monopsonies. But we also learned that once you create those, they're very difficult to get rid of. And so we spent a lot of time talking about the ways you can create an off-ramp for some of the things that you need to create an on-ramp for. And finally, we discussed the fact that really there are no shortcuts or straight lines, that the process of trying to move forward requires adaptive management in every sense of that word, and an ability to both learn from and fold in successes and lessons as we move forward. So 7 points: no fully commercial pathways, partnerships, especially in the middle of the business cycle, middle of the value chain, getting beyond projects, reframing and broadening innovation, prioritizing intermediation, thinking about how to get on and off monopsony bandwagon, and the fact that there are no shortcuts or straight lines. That, you could say, was the consensus that emerged from our 2018 discussion. But at least 2 important insights have come along since then. Some of those we've managed to summarize in a document that you can find on the website of the Community of Practice on Scaling Development Outcomes. It talks about the new consensus. I want to talk about 2 of them in particular. The first one has to do with the fact that often we think about scaling innovation in agriculture as being strictly an issue of agricultural productivity. And frankly, when we had the meeting in 2018, that was, I would say, almost our exclusive focus. But more and more, the attention is moving from agricultural productivity only to what people are now calling food systems. And when we move from ag productivity into the world of food systems, we're now bringing in nutrition, health, environment, a whole series of other considerations. On the upside, that makes for a much fuller picture of change and how it happens. On the downside, that makes what was already a very complicated task even more complicated. And as we've learned in the scaling business, complexity is not our friend. Luckily, at about the same time, we've been learning a lot about how to manage complexity and how to take things that are by their nature complicated, but try to find ways that are either virtuous cycles or inroads or leverage points in trying to make change. You're going to be hearing today and in the other 2 webinars that are going to be conducted on this subject, I think some wonderful examples of exactly that. The second big change since 2018 is a lot of focus on not simply scaling interventions, but scaling outcomes, recognizing that in a world where systems are important, in where complexity is great, and where learning is going to be central, it's impossible in many cases to lock in and simply stay fixed on a particular technical innovation. Instead, we need to keep our eyes squarely on what the outcomes are and to track not only whether things are being rolled out to the sufficient number of people, but whether they're really having the full and intended range of effects. Again, I think you're going to see some terrific cases of that as we move forward. These are the issues, the ones I've just laid out to you, that have preoccupied us in the Agriculture and Rural Development Working Group of the Community of Practice. There are also issues that have occupied many others. We hope that they'll get the attention they deserve, not only in these discussions, but in the weeks and months ahead. And we hope those of you who are not already members of the Community of Practice will sign up. You can do that free of charge by just going to www.scalingcommunityofpractice, all one word, .com, and join our conversation. We know you'll contribute to it, we hope you will in the moments in the weeks ahead. Thank you so much, and good luck with the rest of the discussions, and I look very much forward to joining.
Well, thank you so much, Larry. And as Frank rightly said, you never engage in a conversation with Larry without thinking about things slightly differently and more deeply. So thank you for that. Well, as Larry mentioned, one of the topics that he and I wrestled with as we were putting together that Scaling Up Sourcebook is the role of the private sector in scaling. He talked about monopoly and monopsony. And those discussions about private sector, those really emerged as very important in the UN Food System Summit as well. As folks are realizing that this transformation cannot take place without the private sector. However, the private sector's role can be very controversial. Next speaker, Ms. Ndidi Nwuneli, has thought and written extensively about the role of large and small private enterprises in agriculture and rural development. And her work is also focused on elevating the needs and the voices of underserved groups. Ndidi is the co-founder and managing partner of Sahel Consulting. We'll turn to her now to discuss the role of private sector, women, and youth in scaling. Ndidi, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Ndidi Nwuneli, and I'm a social entrepreneur based in Lagos, Nigeria. I wear a few hats as the co-founder of Ace Foods, the managing partner and co-founder of Sahel Consulting Agriculture and Nutrition, the co-founder of Nourishing Africa, and the founder of Changing Narratives Africa. My topic today is on the role of the private sector, women, and youth in scaling. Coming out of the UN Food System Summit, the private sector's role was discussed at length. I believe the private sector is critical to scaling innovation in agriculture and enabling us to address all the huge bottlenecks and quickly scale up a lot of the interventions that we require to feed the 9 billion people in the world and to ensure that the most vulnerable are not left behind. But when we think about the private sector, we often think about just the medium and large businesses. I believe the private sector starts with our farmers, micro and small enterprises, and then our medium and large businesses, and they each have a critical role to play in scaling. With farmers, we tend to see success when we work with farmers in clusters because they're often fragmented, but they have a critical role to play in pushing for the adoption of technology, improved seeds, and implementation of new programs and harvesting practices. However, they have to be incentivized and there has to be alignment to drive change. Adoption and scaling must be simple and low cost. And when donor funding often dries off, we have to ensure that farmers actually see the true value and that this is demand driven. For macro and small enterprises, they're the largest group in the food ecosystem. They have such a critical role to play because they are drivers of innovation and technology, but also early adopters. Given their fragmentation, the biggest lever is working with industry and trade associations to reach them and empowering them and partnering with them to drive systems and policy changes. They also have a critical role to play as we think about climate change to adjust and adapt to the climate agenda and also to the nutrition agenda. And I believe working with them can be also low cost and simple, but but there has to be a business case for them to adopt and pay for interventions. And finally, our medium and large businesses, they're often the most visible and possibly catalytic given their size and political and cultural influences. They serve as drivers because they scale, and as they scale, they can take along SMEs in their value chain and supply chain and farmers. They're most responsive to pressure from public opinion, and because they have large budgets and PR budgets as well, they can actually push back or serve as game changers. And so the key issues we have to worry about as we work with each of these groups is to ensure that we do not leave anybody behind, especially when we work with farmers. We ensure that we address the equity issues with women, female farmers, but also the inclusivity issues for most of our indigenous populations, our farmers in the most rural areas. For micro and small businesses, we ensure collaboration across the ecosystem, ensuring that nobody is left behind, but no actor is ignored. Because SMEs from logistics to agro-processors to finance providers all have a critical role to play. To the chefs in our ecosystem, and we have to figure out a way to galvanize them. And for the large businesses, the key issue is really around ensuring we don't support greenwashing and nutrition washing. And we really push for a governance and accountability and transparency in the deployment of the resources, but also in scaling as pledges are made that they're actually fulfilled. Beyond the private sector, women and youth have a critical role to play. Of course, these are cross-cutting because we have women and youth in the public and private sector, as well as civil society. But our future is hinged on our ability to ensure equity. Women and youth are visible and critical players in Africa, with 70% of our population under 35. If we do not engage our youth, we're missing out on a huge asset because they're early adopters of innovation and technology, as entrepreneurs, and as employees in our ag and food sector. However, they face critical challenges which we have to address. The bias and discrimination is critical, and we have to set up quotas and special windows to make sure we actually meet the needs of our women and youth. We have to ensure access to assets and financing, access to training and support, ensuring that we shape policy at the national and regional levels to give agency and voice, and that we have a commitment to the private sector and from the public sector and private sector to track progress, to actually track data for private sector, how many women are involved in their supply chain, how many young people are involved in their supply chain, and what mechanisms, such as quotas, are we abiding by and are we fulfilling? Now, when we think about all these groups, through my work, I realized that we cannot ensure scaling unless we have clear mission, values, structures for scaling, pathways to ensure scaling, the right business models that push for scaling, especially because private sector needs a business case, the right talent, the right financing, the appropriate partnerships, and this will enable us to achieve the vision. And our vision has to be hinged on some critical components. And when we think about the business models that scale, and through my work over the last 25 years, and over the last 24 months, actually interviewing entrepreneurs who have scaled in the food and agriculture sector, the concept of demand-driven business models with value addition that's measurable is critical. The ability for entrepreneurs and key stakeholders to leverage technology, data, and innovation to shape the ecosystem, to get involved in shaping policy, to ensure cost efficiency and dynamic systems and structures, to ensure that their branding and their marketing and storytelling is simple and compelling. And finally, every business model, every intervention that supports the private sector, that supports youth, has to build resilience into the DNA. Adaptation to climate change has to be built into the DNA. Agility and ability to mitigate shocks and respond to shocks is critical. COVID-19 demonstrated how critical this is to pivot and to adapt. But COVID-19 is just one shock. There are many more shocks on the way, and climate change is our biggest shock. I just want to end with just a few case studies to illustrate all of this. Through my work in Sahel Consulting, we partner with the Gates Foundation on the Advancing Local Dairy Development in Nigeria project. And we started with a pilot in 2017 to 2019, working with just 2 processors from the private sector to scale their backward integration and their local sourcing for milk in Nigeria. Based on the learnings from that pilot, we actually launched a new 5-year program that is a larger program with 5 processors in 4 states across Nigeria. And it's been an amazing experience because this is a multi-stakeholder ecosystem project that's focused on private sector-led growth in the dairy sector, but also empowering women, addressing nutrition, addressing the bottlenecks in the dairy sector, and shaping policy. And the first key lesson is that you need to understand the complexity of ecosystem projects at scale. So they're government partners, they're dairy sector partners, and they're implementing partners. And at the federal level, state level, and local level, this engagement is critical for success. There's also huge investment in policy. If you don't have an enabling policy environment, your interventions are short-lived. And we have worked collaboratively with the Commercial Dairy Ranchers Association of Nigeria, strengthening this association, actually getting all the actors in the dairy sector together, from the central bank to the Ministry of Health, to the Ministry of Agriculture, to Women Affairs, Infrastructure, Power, to sit down and have a cohesive national dairy policy and to have, clear communications between stakeholders to ensure alignment across the board. And then we've leveraged training for behavioral change and technology to track impact, and definitely engaging male champions, because in our context, women own the milk, men own the cows. It's really important to bring along the men if you want to ensure gender equity. And then definitely strengthening smallholder groups to become cooperatives to ensure financial inclusion, financial literacy, the ability to transact, and the sustainability of cooperatives allows these entities to have bargaining power when they're negotiating the price of their milk, and strengthening them has been critical. And then infrastructure. You can't scale in agriculture and food without the right infrastructure that's climate friendly, sensitive, and actually mitigates risks and shocks. And from solar-powered boreholes to milk cans to milk collection centers to water troughs, water preservation methods, we're looking across the board at how to invest in infrastructure. Beyond Aldine, we launched Nourishing Africa, and this is a one-stop shop to help SMEs, especially young SMEs, scale in the food and agriculture sector in Africa. And we realized the importance of data, the importance of knowledge sharing, and the importance of community. And so this is envisaged as a home for 1 million entrepreneurs that will transform the food and agriculture landscape on our continent. We have a membership portal, but we also have lots of data, funding access, and support for these entrepreneurs. And finally, through our Sahel Scholars Program, we're getting more young people engaged in agriculture. We realize that talent for the sector is one of the huge barriers to scaling. When you ask the average student in agriculture, it's their fifth or sixth choice subject. They couldn't get into medicine or pharmacy, so they are stuck in agriculture and they're trying to get out. And so through Sahel Scholars Program, we're changing the mindsets. We're training faculty, we're training students, we're providing scholarships and internships, and we're empowering the next generation of leaders in our sector. So much learning, so much to do, but I believe everything is possible when we work together. Our vision is ultimately that by 2050, we're going to have a flourishing, sustainable, and just food ecosystem in Africa, which leverages agtech and digital innovations driven by Africa's vibrant entrepreneurs to ensure that the continent nourishes itself and becomes a net exporter of food. I invite you to join me in achieving this vision. There's an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others. I've tweaked it a bit. If you want to go fast and far, leave your egos and logos at the door and work with humility, integrity, excellence, focusing on a shared vision and goals. It's less than 9 years to achieve the SDGs. Zero hunger is one that is achievable, but we need to work collaboratively, scaling our efforts, engaging the private sector, empowering youth, empowering women. And I look forward to working with you to achieve that in our lifetime. God bless you all.
Thank you very much, Ndidi. It was great hearing about the specific examples that you're engaged in, the lessons you're drawing from that. And I also think you introduced some important principles around scaling that we should all take note of in your remarks as well. Before I introduce the next speaker, let me just remind everybody in the audience to please submit questions that you have for the speakers in the Q&A function that should be at the bottom of your screen. And now it gives me pleasure to introduce our third and final speaker, who is Susan Jamba. She is the Director of Vital Landscapes of Food, Forests, and People at the World Resource Institute. Prior to joining WRI, she was a scientist and former colleague of mine, actually, at the World Agroforestry Center. She brings with her experiences of managing large programs aimed at the complex issue of land restoration, as well as knowing well how researchers can contribute to making scaling more effective. So over to the video, please.
Hello, my name is Susan Jamba, and I'm the Director of Vital Landscapes at World Resources Institute. I'm going to discuss about lessons that we have learned from scaling natural resources initiatives. As we've heard from previous speakers, scaling in the context of food systems will become increasingly complex and demanding because we are not simply focusing on increasing agriculture productivity, but doing so while taking care of nature as well as human health. In case of Africa, for example, where increase in agriculture productivity is largely driven by area expansion or expansion into natural ecosystems, this is no longer sustainable and it is no longer acceptable. In industrialized countries as well, where increase in productivity has led to negative environmental impacts, this is no longer acceptable either. So how do we scale technologies that help us increase productivity while taking care of the planet as well as human health? I will draw my lessons today from the Regreening Africa project, a project that I was privileged to lead for at least 3 years while I was working with ECRAF. The aim was to restore 1 million hectares of degraded lands across 8 countries in Africa and benefit 500,000 households. Quite an ambition, right? Oh, and it's important to mention that this was supposed to happen in a span of 5 years with limited resources, a common situation that we find ourselves in agriculture development. So what did we learn from this very ambitious project? Lesson number 1 is that there are no silver bullets. Different technologies will be suited for different agroecological niches as well as different socioeconomic profiles of farmers. So it's very tempting to think that we can have one technology that can be able to implement it and scaled across huge areas that differ in terms of agroecology or that are different in terms of socioeconomic conditions. So in sustainable agriculture practices, we learned very quickly that we had to come up with a suite of technologies and look at how adaptable they were for local context. Besides, we also had to learn that tailoring to the local context is not an issue that we do it as development partners alone, that we have to co-design these technologies with the farmers. So no silver bullets, co-design different technologies suited for the different ecological as well as socioeconomic profile of farmers and do it together with the farmers. Second lesson that we learned is that we need to work, research and development partners need to work concurrently and not separately. We've seen in the past that research is done and it's expected somehow it's going to inform development actors. And with this program, we learned that that was a recipe for failure. We learned that we needed research a lot in certain key areas in this particular project. So we needed research to help us understand where the technologies we were working were being adopted, who was adopting them, were men, women, and youth adopting these technologies at the same pace and at the same scale? If not, why? What was needed to have more equitable outcomes? How about impacts? Were the technologies that we are working with producing desired impacts? So in this case, our intention was not just to regreen the landscapes. Yes, we wanted to regreen the landscapes, but we wanted to do it in a way that was promoting biological diversity. So for instance, we could not go for plantations or plantations of exotics and assume that that was regreening. And by the way, you can see a lot of regreening as well, where you have, in cases where you have invasive species. So it's not just about regreening, it's also looking at aspects of biodiversity and realizing that you need different kind of species, and especially indigenous species that are adapted to this local context. Secondly, we wanted to have impacts around a household well-being. So in this case, we needed to have restoration practices that were A, increasing agricultural productivity, and B, that were also conducive in generating economic impacts and economic benefits for the farmers. We were also looking at trees, for instance, high-value fruit trees that could be able to generate economic impacts, but also add nutritional elements to the households. So when you have this kind of a diverse range of impacts that you're looking for, how do you learn whether your technologies are going to result to that? I'll give you an example. To be able to change or to improve soil fertility, it's not something that happens overnight. So sometimes it will take 10, 15 years to see shifts in terms of soil organic carbon, depending on the technologies that you're promoting. So in the event that we cannot be able to observe these things immediately, research here was extremely important for us, and especially in devising the right kind of methods to be able to evidence different kind of impacts, both in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term. Last but not least, let me just mention here, for instance, how we address this issue. We looked at what we call annual uptake surveys, and annual uptake surveys were helping us to address the aspect of adoption. So how many farmers, as I mentioned earlier, how many farmers, which groups of farmers, how many men, how many women, how many youth, how many indigenous groups were adopting what kind of technologies. So with that, we could be able to see which groups were perhaps adopting faster than others and come up with techniques that would help us to be able to shift and help others to be able to adopt. But we couldn't do that unless we were learning as we were doing. Secondly, on the impact side, we came up with with different kind of methods to evidence different kind of impacts. So we had the adoption surveys as well as impact assessments. And those ones, we could not have done them without research. Third, something else that we learned is we need to understand what are your scaling models and what are the merits and demerits of different scaling models. So for instance, a lot of people assume that if you have a technology, you go to the villages or you go to other areas or to conferences and you train farmers, you train stakeholders, and you go home, those technologies are going to be adopted like wild bushfires. We know very well that that is not the way things happen. So in terms of scaling, for instance, our ambition was very, very high. We wanted to restore 1 million hectares and reach 500 and benefit 500,000 households. So what scaling models should we or did we have to use to be able to reach that target? So we came up with two different kinds of scaling models. There are scaling models that we categorized under direct adoption models. And those models had to be quite intensive. So for instance, we knew if we train X number of farmers in X number of practices, for instance, in farmer-managed natural regeneration, or we train farmers in terms of grafting, or we train farmers in terms of other soil and water conservation techniques, how many farmers did we expect those farmers to then reach directly through the lessons and the knowledge that they had acquired? And that we could be able to track quite easily. Also, we had to use other actors such as extension agents where they existed. We know very well that one of the challenges that we have in agriculture development is that, and especially in a context like Africa, is that the extension services are extremely weak. We don't have sufficient extension agents. And sometimes, even in terms of the knowledge that these extension agents have been trained with, it is not quite updated over time. And thirdly, that they are not even facilitators. Sometimes they don't have the resources that they need, the vehicles or the motorbikes, to be able to reach a wide range of farmers. So you can't rely on just extension services. So we had to have a mix of these, what we call direct adoption scaling models, farmer to farmer and learning. We had extension agents and other methods. Secondly, we realized that those methods were extremely effective, but they were also resource intensive. And so it was practically impossible for us to train a lot of farmers and extension agents and other actors to be able to reach our 500,000 number of farmers. So what did we do? We came up with what we call the indirect adoption targets. So we divided our targets. These ones was what we were going to reach through direct methods, and this is direct scaling methods, and then other targets that we had to reach using indirect scaling methods. And what do I mean by indirect scaling methods? For instance, we used radios, we used radio programs, we used television programs, we used other communication channels, but also we were using aspects to do with leveraging on policy. So if you remove policy barriers, and during those workshops you work with other extension agents and other government actors, we were hoping that we could be able to reach wider numbers with these kind of technologies. And I'll come to that in my last point, but just to mention that in these direct and indirect scaling methods, we had to understand what were the merits and demerits of each. And eventually, we learned that we could easily be able to evidence our impacts more accurately from direct scaling methods than from the indirect ones. With this, we had to remind ourselves the famous quote by Einstein that not everything that counts can be counted. Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. So we had to be at peace that sometimes some of our impacts and some of our outcomes, we could not necessarily be able to evidence them, but we knew very well that we could have a rough idea of how many, for instance, farmers a radio programs was able to reach, or a TV program, and other methods, and other methods of indirect scaling. Last but not least, we had to look at aspect of addressing barriers to adoption of technologies that lie outside the technology in itself. So don't assume that just because a technology is good, just because that a technology is suited for different contexts, it's going to be adopted. In other words, not all good technologies are adopted. And this is because there are many barriers that lie outside the technology itself. So for instance, we have heard a lot about addressing issues of land and tree tenure in order to catalyze adoption of sustainable land management practices. I'll give you an example. In Niger, for instance, where we've seen a case that is documented of at least 5 million hectares that have been restored or that at least have been regreened using farmer-managed natural regeneration. How did we overcome the challenges of policy barriers? For instance, in that case that I mentioned in Niger, one of the key things that really happened for farmers to be able to take up farmer-managed natural regeneration was when government officials stopped imposing some of the barriers to tree and land ownership. So when farmers knew that they had the legitimate authority and they had the freedom to be able to practice farmer-managed natural regeneration, and that they were not prevented, and that they could be able to make decisions about these trees when the trees were regenerated or their funds, that there were no fines that were being imposed for them for using the trees that they were regenerating, then we see a huge number of trees being regenerated on farmers' lands. So it's not just about the technology itself, it's also understanding what kind of policy barriers do we need to address. Now, I'm very happy to report that by the time I was leaving the project, we already had the presidential decree in Niger on farmer-managed natural regeneration, where the president himself had acknowledged and produced a decree that was showing the importance of farmer-managed natural regeneration in regreening landscapes in Niger. And that means not every regeneration method in Niger had to depend on tree planting, that there was a recognition in terms of local knowledge on rights of farmers to trees and rights of farmers to use and make decisions about trees, and therefore farmer-managed natural regeneration becoming an important technique for restoring lands. So really, it's not just about the technology itself, even though the technology could be good, it's also addressing those other policy barriers and barriers that do lie outside the technology. So I think those are the 4 key areas, 4 key lessons that I'd like to share in terms of how we can be able to scale up natural resources, regeneration of natural resources, farmer-managed natural regeneration, tree planting or other methods, soil and water conservation, and really improve crop productivity, but also taking care of the environment and also looking at health of farmers. When you improve nutrition, when you improve household food security, you're really looking at health and nutrition of farmers. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Chamba. During your presentation, I was scribbling furiously and really thinking about how much your experiences will be valuable now. Thinking about all the things that the UN Food Systems Summit was discussing. You really are at the boundary between agriculture and natural resources and figuring out how we can do both. So I hope, Dr. Chamba, you'll be able to share some of the resources with our community by posting them in the Purdue resource page. And also, I think, we'd love to share some of those resources as well in the community of practice page. Well, now we are now welcoming our speakers back live for a question and answer session. Welcome to all of you. Again, thank you for your wonderful presentations. And we thank you for the participants for entering your question and answer. Please continue to do that. While you're still thinking and writing your questions, Frank and I are going to start out with a couple of questions that we have for the presenters. And so and this is, I'm starting out, I'm saying Larry, but it's really for all of the presenters. So Larry noted that simplicity is one of the best predictors of scaling. I think he said at least 3 times, complexity is not our friend. Okay. But Larry, the new food systems conceptual framework and the imperative to address multiple objectives adds a tremendous amount of complexity to all aspects of the scaling process. To all 3 of you, I wonder if you could draw on your experience and provide our listeners with some navigation advice. What advice can you offer scaling practitioners? What are your tips on bringing an expanded systems approach into scaling planning and implementation without becoming paralyzed by complexity and overanalysis? So Larry, would you like to take a bite out of that one, and then we'll turn to the other presenters.
Thanks for such a nice, easy question, Julie. So I mean what I said before. I really do think that the complexity is a major problem in trying to scale, and the more things can be systematized and unified and aggregated, the easier it is. But sometimes reality doesn't cooperate. And one thing I would say is that complicated objectives don't always require complicated interventions. I mean, think about things like girls' education, or rural water supplies, or mobile money. Those things attacked situations where the objectives were incredibly complicated, but someone was clever enough to put in place interventions that weren't equally complicated. So sometimes you don't have to match the complexity of the problem with the complexity of the solution. That's the best case. So for me, in terms of trying to square the circle that you're talking about, that would be my ideal, but even that's not possible. And one of the things we know is that in these food systems interventions, they're almost always affected by context. So the ability to have a simple solution that's uniformly applied is really limited by the fact that reality just isn't like that. So I think this is my answer, that there's a reality of trade-offs in this. And that even after you've tried your best to simplify, if you have multiple objectives, you're going to have to make some choices along the way. And I'd give just a little bit of guidance on how to do that. And for example, if you've got natural resource objectives alongside nutritional objectives, alongside income objectives, I think you have to think through all of them and say, what's more important to me than what? How much am I willing to trade off one against the other? As development people, we're very reluctant to be responsible for a sin of omission, to leave something out. But sometimes you just can't fully do everything, or you do this partially and that partially, and you say that's the best we can do with the situation we have at hand. The other dimension of that for me is that the benefits and the costs are not borne equally. I mean, think about even trying to trade off productivity and natural resource management. I'll leave health out just for the moment. The people who bear the natural resource benefits and costs, imagine it's soil erosion. That may be the very same farmer who's gaining or losing productivity. So you say, well, which is more important to you? Then you're demand driven. But what if you're trying to go for the benefits of that are not primarily that farmer, they're the world. And you're asking that farmer to bear the cost, to trade off productivity in return for an objective that he or she doesn't receive. In that case, somebody else needs to be prepared to compensate for that if it's really what you want that person to do. So what I would say in the first and second instance is, of course, look for a simple solution that meets multiple objectives. But secondly, be prepared to face trade-offs and make choices around it. And finally, I would say something that was a couple of us said in the presentations, which is that sometimes you're not monitoring the fidelity of the intervention. You're monitoring the outcomes that you really care about. And that means there are going to be adjustments along the way, and keeping track of whether it's really producing the effect, positive and negative, that you care about is going to be very important as people make those sorts of adaptations in real time.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Larry. So, so your response actually generated at least 5 more questions from me, but let me, I will try to hold myself back and ask Dr. Jamba and Ms. Nwuneli, would you like to add anything here?
Yeah, so maybe I can come in. I just want to reiterate that complexity does not need to be complicated. And Basically, I think complexity implies that we avoid linear thinking that will not address what I mentioned in that recorded video, that diversity in terms of ecological and socioeconomic context. So my tips in terms of how we can be able to scale goes back to maybe 2 or 3 points. First of all is the need to embed research within development programs so that we are learning. And the goal is not necessarily to, evidence minor incremental, outcomes, but to see how those lead to transformational changes in the end. And I think Larry is extremely correct here that we need to focus a lot on the outcomes. And scaling is not just about the specific activities, but also on outcomes. But also that we need to foster a genuine participatory process where we are engaging with the farmers and other stakeholders so that we are learning together, and that farmers' knowledge or local knowledge should not be interpreted to be inferior compared to, for instance, scientific knowledge. We need both of them to be able to progress together. And last but not least is, to focus on the desired outcomes, realizing that we have different pathways to realizing those outcomes. So scaling is not just about, how much particular technology has been adopted, but what kind of outcomes and impacts we are getting from different kinds of technology. So if our outcome is to see a reduction in poverty, or our outcome is to be able to see positive environmental indicators or positive human health indicators, then we need to focus on different technologies that help us reach there, knowing very well we need to scale that outcome. So how many households are we able to see improving their livelihoods, and to what extent, which is then our impact indicator. So I think I just wanted to add those to some excellent discussions already. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Susan. And Didi, I wonder if you could respond to what Larry and Susan put out. And I also, I wonder, Larry was talking about trade-off analysis, and Frank, that's going to be tremendously important, of course, in the new round of CG initiatives and thinking about trade-offs. But I mean, honestly, we haven't been very good or very transparent up to now, about who's going to benefit and who's actually going to pay for this, and making that kind of, of course, we all learned about it in our economics classes, but to the extent to which it's done in real life, the COP26 discussions, case in point there. So Ndidi, what suggestions might you have for us? First on, getting our minds around the complexity, but not being overwhelmed about it. But, this whole issue of transparency and our ability to really pragmatically walk the walk on trade-off analysis and making choices and making compensations.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks to all the speakers. This has been a very stimulating discussion so far. I completely agree with some of the comments that have been made by the two previous speakers. And my only addition is that when we think about trade-offs and sustainability, ultimately, the private sector has to lead the charge. Nothing is going to be done sustainably by government or civil society because of lack of resources. And our ability to amplify and ensure long-term engagement is really by partnering with the private sector. When I think about the CGIAR and one CGIAR, I'm excited about the reforms, but I'm also concerned that so much of the work that is done at the CGIAR never gets commercialized and never gets scaled through partnerships with the private sector. I'll use the example in our own backyard. We've worked very closely with IITA for a number of years, and many of you know the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture. It's done tremendous work in the food and agricultural landscape. And oftentimes, we are the first ones to bring private sector organizations to visit IITA, to even understand what IITA does, and to even embrace IITA for scaling. And I remember the first time we took a bank to IITA, First Bank, it's one of the oldest and largest banks. So they said, the ag team said this was their first time being on the IITA campus and actually seeing the innovations, and they were so excited. So the first thing is we need to work across the divide. We need to partner more effectively, and we need to get out of our comfort zones and embrace key partners. And one key partner is the financial services sector. And I know many of us don't understand or like the financial services sector, but this is where trade-offs comes in and compromise comes in. There has to be a business case for engagement with every single ecosystem actor. Financial systems are critical, insurance systems are critical, but we also need processing companies, we need the seed companies, we need all the different actors to work together. And when we think about the trade-offs, first, there's a mindset trade-off that has to occur. And I think this is often the hardest, where we have to build trust and we have to say we're on the same side and have a shared vision. The second is really the concept of who bears the cost and who takes the reward. And how this cost is shared is really important. How the risk is shared is really important. How we engage all actors from the beginning through the messy process to ultimately share the risk, share the cost, and share the glory is critical. And many times we don't want to share that risk. We don't want to share the cost, and we also don't want to share the glory. And then the most important thing for me is an enabling policy environment. And many times we'd like to say, well, the government is not creating that. We have to push the government to be held accountable. And I think coming out of FSS, coming out of COP, so many great announcements. Who holds them accountable, and what are the trade-offs? Holding big business, holding private sector, holding governments accountable, as well as the research communities to play their part. And I think it's oftentimes we come from a mindset of lack instead of a mindset of abundance. Let's commit to growing the pie and creating more wins together. For me, that's the huge mindset shift that has to occur. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ndidi.
Yeah.
Frank, turn over to you to
Sure.
take some of the questions from the participants.
Yeah, well, let me follow up because indeed your final remark triggered a question, I think, from within the group and from the audience as well. And when it relates to policy, because all three speakers mentioned the importance of policy. Larry said, well, you can't think of private sector scaling alone in agriculture. Indeed, he just talked about it here, but also Susan referred to the importance of policy in the regreening initiatives, especially from Niger's case. So the question to all of you, first question, I think, is how can stakeholders make their voices heard to influence policy? So we know it's important. We know we have to move on that, but how can we really, what are some approaches that we can take so that the stakeholders can make their voices heard to influence policy? And I guess a related question too, and indeed he just referred to the sharing of the costs as well. And so financing, if you can reflect also on the experience you've had in mobilizing finance for scaling, especially financing some of the non-technical issues as policy engagement, because this is not cost-free, of course, to mobilize people, and building capacity of public services or the capacity even of policymakers to understand the issues at hand, which seem to be challenging. So if you could comment on that, and maybe we can start in reverse order with Susan and go back to Ndidi and Larry.
So thank you so much, Frank. And maybe I should start by saying we don't necessarily have a shortage of policies. It's not in all cases where policy has, we need more policies. In fact, when we do policy analysis in most areas like natural resource management, in a lot of countries, we realize there are so many policies. The problem is they are uncoordinated, they are not integrated, they're in silos. Some policies are in the Ag Ministry, others in the Environment Ministry, others in Climate Change Ministry. And we don't have coordination, we don't have integration. Sometimes it's also an aspect of implementation. So sometimes we have fantastic policies. I come from a country where we are experts in formulating policies, really good policies. The challenge can be in terms of implementing policies. So it's not always that we need to make new policies. That said, and especially in areas where it's not very controversial, it's not very difficult to bring together stakeholders to make policies. I think the policies that become extremely difficult is where we have controversial issues. And, we are all sitting here and listening to each other. And for instance, if I could pick a policy on food systems transformation in Africa, should we be going more for, what kind of seed varieties, what kind of input should we be using? That's a very big controversy right now in the food systems. We saw it in the food system. We've seen it play out on the continent. So how do you bring together stakeholders who hold different, divergent interests into this space? How do you engage with private sector, for instance, who possibly will make a lot of profit when farmers, smallholder farmers use, for instance, synthetic fertilizers. But on the other hand, we've done research and we've seen areas where you don't necessarily have farmers sometimes are not getting enough returns from their investments when they buy these. And so farmers are caught up in debts. They are caught up in unsustainable investments, and we are not seeing improvement in terms of livelihoods of these smallholder farmers. So how do you bring together actors with divergent interests to make a policy or to change policies that will be able to produce the desired results? I did not even mention some of the research as well that is pointing on issues of soil health as a result of use of some of excessive use of synthetic fertilizers. So these are the kind of policies that will become very difficult in bringing together stakeholders. And so if you ask me how to do it, I think we need to be very, very honest here in terms of where we have evidence, where we are making policies or decisions based on our beliefs as opposed to solid scientific evidence, and how we can be able to bring together stakeholders to be able to address these issues. And I think for me, scientific evidence is critical because we can argue on values and beliefs, but where there's solid evidence in terms of impact, it's very difficult to argue. So then we say, how can we be able to change these things systematically? And that's where research comes very strongly, but also engaging stakeholders and looking at what would be the positive outcomes for all stakeholders. So how can even the private sector, for instance, as Didi mentioned, how can we be able to expand the pie of sustainability rather than just pushing on the same model? So I think every stakeholder needs to see what's the positive thing for them in engaging in some of these policy changes. Let me pause there, Frank, and get other people to chip in as well.
Sure. And Didi, did you want to come in? And then
yes.
After that, Larry.
Thank you so much. Yeah, just building on the previous comments, I really think we need stronger ecosystem partnerships and participation in policy making. And I'll give an example with the Nigeria Dairy Development Project that scaled to the Advancing Local Dairy Development. We realized we needed unusual actors sitting together at the federal level, state level, and federal level. So we created national advisory councils. And from the onset, we decided to strengthen the local dairy association called CODERAN, Commercial Dairy Ranchers Association of Nigeria, because they have to be strong enough to have a voice, and they have to be a membership-driven organization that's sustainable. And members understand they're getting value when the policy shifts occur. And you don't have to compel people to become members for a strong voice in the policy landscape. And we've seen this play out. And so CODERAN is well positioned to now pull all the players together. And together, we actually sat down and revised our national dairy policy in Nigeria because we found out the central bank had a different policy from the Ministry of Trade, a different policy from the Ministry of Agriculture. Every single agency had their own dairy policy. And unless you have a cohesive voice that's private sector led, saying it hurts us here, and demand-driven approaches to shaping policy, data that is solid data is critical. And in our case, what was the data we're using? It's the importation of milk from the rest of the world. You're trying to create a local dairy sector. Meanwhile, imports are growing. Right? We spend over $1 billion importing dry milk into a country that has the fourth largest cattle herd in Africa. So using data to say, yes, the policy is not working. It's not, we need to change tariffs. We need to change quotas. That was critical. So I think for me, it's strong industry associations, an ecosystem solution where you have all players together with an aligned vision, and pressure from the farmers and the private sector where it hurts the most to keep government accountable so that you have aligned interests. And then the importance of investing in local data and scientific research, the point has been made, but I think we don't publicize enough data. And this is where academia can help us raise the standards of the data collection and the dissemination to ensure that our policymakers have the right tools and skills to push for the right agenda. for me, I don't think we have enough policies. Our policies have not moved as fast as they should as the world has evolved. So we need to have more policies that are aligned to the current needs of our ecosystem to ensure the scaling that is required.
Super. Thanks, Ndidi. Over to you, Larry. And if you wanted to talk a little bit about financing for scaling as well, okay, based on your experiences.
Well, I feel like I should just say amen to the last two comments, but I got a couple more I'll add on, which is it's not an accident that in scaling agriculture and food systems, we started with productivity. That was not just blindsidedness. That's because financial incentives line up most easily with productivity because it's money for money. But when we look at things like money for health or money for the environment, it's a more complicated equation in terms of who benefits, who pays, and therefore how you raise the financing to do it, particularly when the benefits are long-term and the costs are short-term. There's this phenomenon that people write about now called hyperbolic discounting. All it means is that people care much more about the present than they do about the future. And you're asking them to forego something or invest something now for hopes later. Well, for poor farmers, that's asking an awful lot. So somebody else better be willing to make that investment. That's the first point I would make. That basically, the agricultural production productivity ones are the easiest ones to link the financial side with the other side. The others require much more thought in terms of where the benefits are, who has the incentives. This is an extension of the argument about demand-driven. Because if we say we want it to be demand-driven, you have to say whose demand. If it's a small farmer's demand, then it's going to prioritize whatever that small farmer prioritizes. If they prioritize health, it'll prioritize health. If they prioritize conservation, it'll prioritize conservation. If they prioritize, as they often do, short-term productivity, it's going to prioritize that. That's my first point. The second point is that collective action is hard. Trying to get a group of people, particularly diverse stakeholders, to come together on something requires assiduous effort of just the kind Ndidi and Susan were talking about. Somebody has to put in the time, the energy, and the resources. I think that's the perfect spot for donors, but you can't push a rock uphill. You can't push someone to want something they don't want. You can just find the real interest and really bring them together into the same dialogue, the same conversation. And investing in that when you think that alignment is possible is a hugely beneficial investment that none of the parties would make themselves without somebody bringing the earnest money that will make that happen. It's a terrific role, in my opinion, for donors. And finally, I would say, I for a long time was against, but I've changed my mind about blended finance. It seems to me that on some of these things, I used to be of the view that blended finance usually gave you a bad version of both. But I've now seen enough cases where blended finance makes it possible to add in a dimension of something that would not have been possible otherwise, considering objectives beyond the ones that the parties involved would otherwise consider. And so I think if it's thought through carefully, it's again a place that people on the philanthropic side can add a tremendous value to reinforcing, not cross-cutting the things that the private sector would do for itself.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Larry. So I also want to put in a plug. We'll be talking a lot more about finance in the December 7th panel discussion on scaling. That one's going to be moderated by Simon Winter of Syngenta Foundation. So let's turn to some of the other questions from our participants. We've got a question from Dr. Gale, who is the former Secretary of Agriculture in Maharashtra State in India, and who's going to be a speaker on our November 30th panel. So he says, food systems are full of agroverticals like soil, seeds, nutrients, and many more until consumption. And which are the innovations in horizontal integration of these verticals in a value chain for scaling innovations? And Dr. Gale, I want to point you shamelessly to Larry's and my Scale Up source book, which tried to really collect some of the case studies that we discovered during the Purdue conference of 2018. And there's quite a lot in there about what we've learned about improving value chains for inputs, et cetera. And also, I think, quite a bit on the experience of groups like 1 Acre Fund, for example, in Babangona in Nigeria, that have done quite a lot of impressive work in trying to make value chains work better. So I wonder if Susan or Ndidi or Larry would have anything more that you would like to add on that to Dr. Gale's question. So maybe Larry, start with you, since
I'll add just a tiny piece. You and I are joined at the hip on this, so I would have said what you said, which I think is exactly right. But by adding a little piece onto that, it would be that sometimes verticals are the right thing to do. And I understand that's not the argument we're having today, because we're trying to bring in more and more dimensions of things. But vertical is not always wrong. And sometimes it not only can accomplish an important objective, it can be the driver that pushes the other things along. And one thing we know is that horizontal coordination is much more difficult than vertical, because vertical tends to be within a single organization or within a single flow of benefits. Horizontal requires somebody to basically invest in either a structural or a behavioral solution that cuts across those silos. And so the things that you were talking about, Julie, are examples of somebody who did exactly that. They invested in trying to figure out ways to unify across those chains. And that's a lot of what we call intermediation in the conversations that we've been having about this. But I will absolutely concede Dr. Gale's point, which is that the verticals are easier to conceptualize and easier to manage than the horizontals. And so trying to, where it's really necessary to have horizontals, somebody needs to be very conscious. And think about what Ndidi was saying in pulling together those associations across stakeholders. That doesn't happen by itself. Somebody has to really decide that's important enough or necessary enough. And I'll just say one last thing, which is that all those things involve coordination. And that's a word which everybody likes if they're the coordinator. But nobody likes it if they're the coordinated in that. And so to try and figure out where the most economical use of coordination is and who can do that in a way that will be accepted by the other parties ends up being a critical dimension of this notion of horizontal coordination.
I ask Susan and Ndidi to weigh in if they want, but I also want to add a little bit here that brings in another question. So Ndidi, that your case study on the dairy sector was fascinating, and I have to admit, the first time I went to Nigeria, I just thought it was so shocking, that all the milk was imported. So I'm looking forward to going back and having more Nigerian dairy in the future. But maybe, that's an unusual case, right, where there isn't any sort of established playing field yet. Like nobody except the importers are going to have their ox gored by a thriving local dairy sector. But I think several people in the conversation have brought up, this is continuing the unequal voices. And yes, of course, associations, that's very important. And Larry, absolutely right. That we're always short of resources to bring those sort of convening and leveling of the playing field. But when you talk about, it's something that we economists, I think we always sort of, we shy away from, right? We're informing, but we're not pushing, we're not influencing too much, because that's not our role. And perhaps inadvertently, we play into strengthening the existing structure. But as we saw during the UN Food System Summit, and as we've been talking today, change is hard. Yeah. People or organizations are used to things operating a certain way. Change may threaten their cheese, as the saying goes. What are scaling researchers and implementers supposed to do in really affecting the enabling environment, especially in cases where change is difficult? Yeah, I mean, yes, we can provide the mechanism to bring different groups together, but how is it possible to put the thumb on the scale when needed, and who does that? To put this thumb on the scale on behalf of youth or women to make sure they're getting their just desserts. Anyway.
Thank you so much. Yes, I hear you loud and clear, and I'll use a different example, which is cassava. So, as you know, Nigeria is one of the largest producers of cassava in the world, and IIT has been leading research for years on cassava stems and new varieties. And we're currently engaged in a project called Basics. It had the first phase, now it has the second phase. But what is unique about Basics is last week we had, a National Cassava Summit. Typically, when you have a research organization focused just on the seed systems, they don't invite all the actors across the chain. And in this case, we had commissioners of agriculture, we had central bank, we had the African Development Bank, we had farmers, we had processors of industrial cassava starch, and we had consumers. And I just thought that the level of discussion around policy was different because you created space. And I think agency, voice, and space is something we have to be cognizant of. And we who have power, all sitting on this forum because we have some power, need to create those spaces and always have a gender and youth lens, but also all the unusual actors in the entire ecosystem. So it wasn't called a Cassava Seed Summit. It was called a Cassava Summit. That's a change, right? And I think I'm excited to see the research institutions making that pivot because this narrow lens is what has gotten us into the scaling bottlenecks that we've seen, right? And I think first creating the space, the agency, and the voice, and then holding ourselves accountable to track. And I gave the communique at the end of the summit, and I said, let's not come back here and have another summit without saying what happened between the last summit and this summit. And that's also the challenge to all of us sitting here to say, what has changed? Given the targets we set for ourselves, given the goals, given the issues, we can come back and talk about land. Land continues to be a problem when it comes as women farmers in agriculture, in cassava. Yes, every year we talk about land. What has changed? So I think for me, especially for the most vulnerable, we have to make sure that they're in the room, that we don't serve as representatives. We have to track changes. We have to bring in all actors, and we have to ensure that together we continue to push those boundaries and get out of our own way and our comfort zone. And it takes that awareness, like you've said, but it also takes our willingness to be humble as we make mistakes along the way and to actually talk about the failures as well.
Thank you, Ndidi. It's wonderful. And Susan, do you have anything to add? And then I'm going to turn over to Frank for the last question I think we'll be able to address today.
Yeah, difficult to come in without appearing to split hairs here, but perhaps just to mention that, I totally agree with my previous speakers and especially the aspects of having different stakeholders in the room. Just to, again, perhaps mention that from a social science perspective, we also know that they are called stakeholders because they have different stakes and there's different power dynamics. So just having everybody in the room does not mean that everybody's interest and perspectives will take the same level. It's a good starting point, but it's not what will translate into, for instance, for poor development policy or gender positive development policy. Recognizing that, for instance, government's power lies around incentives, subsidies, regulatory frameworks. Private sector have got immense power in investment and innovation. Social movements have immense power on consumer and society behavior, and different stakeholders will have different. So it's good for us to understand that even though we're in the room, we don't bring the same kind of power dynamics and decision making. We've seen a lot of research that have documented places where you have men and women in the room and in rural context and where women don't necessarily voice their concerns. And so it's not just about, it's going beyond that. And I think for scaling to be transformative, we need to be able to have strategies that do address those power dynamics. And as mentioned earlier, ensure that we are making decisions based on data and we are tracking. We are having accountable systems and tracking systems that we can be able to evidence. Just to mention, I saw a good question on attribution and contribution. I hope it will be asked because I think that's a difficult one. And even though I may not be able to answer it personally, I'd love for other speakers as well to weigh in on that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Susan. Yeah, we are in our last couple of minutes, I'm told. So I want to give you each, time to give a message that you would like to share before we close the session. But, Yes, in that line, Susan, if you're willing to take on that question about attribution contribution, as you do that, please do so. The other question I would, pose to people if they have a short intervention on it is about potential losers from scaling, because it was mentioned by Larry that not everybody's a winner in these processes, and so if the question is for those of us involved in scaling, how can what should we do about the awareness of losers in this? How can they be brought on board? Should we find ways of compensating them, et cetera, et cetera? So should we basically give this more attention in our scaling work? And the concept of responsible scaling has been mentioned previously as well. So if you want to take a bit of that, fine, but also leave us with a parting message as we close. Thanks. I don't know who to start with. Maybe I'll start with Ndidi first this time, and then over to Susan and then Larry. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Great questions, great contributions. It's been a phenomenal session. Just to address this issue of winners and losers, I think it's all about redrawing the lines and increasing the pie. I'm an eternal optimist, and I think that we're starting from such a low base in many of our countries. And even in the countries where we already have a lot of development, there's so much opportunity to change behavior. So I think if we have this, what I call the abundance mentality, where we're growing the pie, it means that people are going to have to adjust, but it doesn't mean that they all have to lose. And for me, it's about how do we shape the dialogue? How do we shape the incentives? How do we create disincentives? And how do we create alignments? And I've seen it work. It's not easy. It takes time. There are lots of failures, but communication is key. Having the right people at the table, making sure no one is left behind, and addressing the needs of the most vulnerable. I also think it's important for now, and this is my parting comment, that we really push boundaries when it comes to the partnerships we have. And we remove the biases we have around partnering with private sector in particular, with financial institutions. I love that Larry says he's more accepting of the concept of blended finance. I think we have to be more accepting of the opportunity to experiment, to learn, to adjust, to pivot, and to keep growing, because we need to scale. It's less than 8 harvests or 9 harvests to achieving the SDGs. We are failing on climate agendas. We look like we're failing on the food systems targets right now, with the more people going into hunger and poverty. So there's a sense of urgency that we all must embrace to work together to scale. And for me, I think having all actors at the table, creating spaces for those who have been left behind, and keeping, at the end of the day, sustainability and private sector-led sustainable demand-driven growth at the forefront of what we do and how we design, we will change our approach and we'll see more success stories. I also love, and I have to commend Julie and Larry and the entire team at Purdue for making the effort to bring in voices such as mine, because I think those are really critical. Oftentimes we have discussions just amongst ourselves, and then bringing in unusual actors is critical. So I would say, my favorite African proverb says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others. And we need to go together. And sometimes it's uncomfortable, but together we can achieve impact. I look forward to celebrating more successes so that when we come back next year, we're talking about what we achieved in the last year leading up to this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And to you, Susan. Over to you, Susan.
Yeah, so perhaps speaking on where Ndidi left, coming next year and many years, evidencing and talking about what we've achieved. And that brings the question of attribution and contribution. I think we are living in a world now where there's so much, we are sort of really looking for success story, and some of these success stories are not backed up by evidence. So attribution, it could take a long time to go into the scientific discussions of what this means, but basically, if we are running a program, or scaling, we want to reach a certain number of farmers, we want to reduce perhaps, poverty to certain levels. A program has, certain indicators, and so that's its promised contribution. But how do we know that if those indicators are even met, that you can really associate that with the certain program? So that's the aspect of attribution. And that's even more difficult because we don't live in a world where you can control everything, and especially in development. You could have your own program that is running dairy work or restoration work, and other partners are also doing in a certain area. So how do you attribute that success to your own initiative as opposed to a lot of actors? I think for scientific basis, that's important, because otherwise it's difficult to make future decisions or to draw recommendations for other programs. But in terms of development, I think once we can be able to see the contribution that a lot of programs and projects are making to livelihoods, to nature, to soils, to productivity, that for us should be the primary goal. And it's important that we are able to do that. So I think for scientists, it's a constant battle in terms of research and developing, more robust methods to be able to measure the two. But I think for us, what we want to see a lot is how many farmers in Africa are shifting from poverty, how much food and healthy food is being produced, and how much are we doing this in recognition and taking care of the environment. Thank you. And parting shot, thank you so much also for the invitation. Truly enjoyed the discussion, and from all the participants in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And now over to you, Larry.
Well, I would say that the aspiration that several of us voiced, that this is a second inflection point, is validated by the conversation. I mean, it really feels like this is a different conversation than we had in 2018, and it builds really nicely on where that was. I'm not frightened by the complexity that we're introducing. I actually think it's a very positive feature. It just forces us to think the way we're thinking. And one way is to say somebody has to be so smart they have to figure out all the answers, how all these things interact. I think that's an impossible aspiration. Another notion is we solve that by having a larger circle of people having the conversation, and that in the give and take of different people pushing on different parts of that equation, we come up with the best possible thing for the largest number of people. So I strongly align myself with the kinds of statements that both Susan and Didi were making about the value of inclusiveness. It's not just a social value, it's the way we reconcile the complexity of these objectives. Because what I would say in response to something you said before, Frank, is that it's impossible to squeeze values out of this. We shouldn't squeeze values out of it. Values are what drive people to do things. Values are what makes it worthwhile to do things, but neither can we assume that everybody's values are the same. So unless we're going to set somebody up as the supreme arbiter of this, we better make sure that the people who we care about are party to the conversation, because nobody can express their values better than they can. And it's only by that complexity, that we have a chance of reconciling the objective complexity in the world about how we move from here to there. So I want to also end by thanking you for this, you, Purdue, and everybody else involved. It's a really nice step forward.
Thank you, Larry. Let me ask Julie now to wrap up before we move into the business meeting.
Great. Thank you. Well, really, my final comment is wow. And thank you to our presenters, Larry and Didi and Susan, for such an enriching and also very thought-provoking set of presentations and the discussion today. So I have bad news and good news. The bad news is we didn't get to everybody's questions, but the good news is that this is not the end of this discussion. This is just the beginning of our series of panels on scaling. So we'll be taking your questions into the next two panels, and hopefully we'll take you along with your questions. So please join us. Those panel discussions are going to take place on November 30th. And the theme there is making the transition from projects to systems change, which we've already started to talk about here. So how do we think about that conceptually, and what experiences do we have on multi-sector coordination? We'll be talking about agriculture and health nutrition coordination, et cetera, et cetera. Then on December 7th, as promised, we'll focus again on issues of finance, delve more deeply into issues of finance and accountability. And the future research agenda for scaling. So we hope you all can join us then.